Hello, hello. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone. Today's chat is about the low FODMAP diet, and I have a great pleasure of speaking with Erica, who is a fellow dietitian who is trained in the low FODMAP diet. And we thought that we would cover this topic now in Twixmas, this period between Christmas and New Year, because I think a lot of people with IBS have gone through quite a bit of festive eating and looking at getting back on track with the low FODMAP diet, as well as those of you that have perhaps been told that you should be going on it after you've spoken to your GP and want a little bit more information and are getting ready to start off on the low FODMAP journey as of January. So we're hoping to share lots of tips, frequently asked questions around the low FODMAP diet, how to do it properly, and just to sort of dig into Erica's expertise. So she's a registered dietitian and she has trained within the low FODMAP diet at King's College London, and she has the advanced diploma in the low FODMAP diet. She's also a member of the British Dietetic Association Gastroenterology Group. So she has a wealth of experience within the area of IBS and the low FODMAP diet. She also works within obesity and works a lot with bariatric patients or patients about to undergo bariatric surgery. So she's covered a lot of different clinical areas, so we can ask her a range of different questions. And I'm really excited because I think that starting off the low FODMAP diet can be a really, really tricky experience if you haven't got the right advice. It doesn't have to be hard. It's quite a difficult and complicated diet, but with the right guidance, as from Erica, it can be an easy experience. Hi, Erica. How are you?
Hi, Sasha. I'm all right. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really good. I've just given a little bit of an introduction to your wealth of experience, and but I'd love to hear a little bit of an introduction about why you became a dietitian and how you got interested in the low FODMAP diet.
Yeah. So, well, in a nutshell, I have had myself IBS since I was about 14. I'm now 44, so it's been quite a long time, a few decades. And I was always looking for a solution, a way to manage my IBS. But at the time, there wasn't much knowledge of it at all. And in fact, I was misdiagnosed as wheat intolerant, possibly celiac. So I had to have a long period of trials and errors, a lot of errors. And when I worked in a doctor's surgery around 2003, I met a dietitian, and I was very fortunate that the doctors and the dietitian there were really supportive and wanted me to follow my interests and dreams. So I started shadowing his clinic. I got to meet a lot of patients. I would see a dietitian, ask a lot of questions to the doctors and the dietitian, and it became a passion that I really wanted to continue pursuing. And I went to university and became a dietitian in 2009. The thing that I like the most about dietetics is the fact that there are so many health conditions that can improve with diet, which is fairly easy to do. So instead of having to take drugs or having surgeries or horrible things that are scary and painful, we can modify our health conditions with diet and sometimes prevent them, even completely resolve them. For example, I worked with a lot of patients that do have celiac disease and they have to be on a gluten-free diet for life. But doing that will pretty much help them have a normal life. And I worked with a lot of allergies and obviously IBS as well. And IBS wasn't very well understood at all when I first was a dietitian. For the low FODMAP diet, which is the specialist diet for IBS, was only created by Monash University in Melbourne, Australia in 2005. And it took some time to become noted and used. I only trained a few years later with my colleagues in NHS Trust. They had trained first at King's College and they trained me. So I started covering the clinic and seeing patients that have IBS. And eventually I went into the advanced course and I continue to see patients privately. That's when I met Guy, who is the founder of Tummy, the app and website I work for as well as a consultant dietitian. And that app and website can support patients or clients looking to try the FODMAP diet, basically.
So you've mentioned the FODMAP diet. For those that don't know, can you give a quick explanation about what the diet is? And you've mentioned it's a diet for IBS, so we should outline that it's not a diet for weight loss. But if you want to just briefly explain what it is, that'd be great.
In fact, it probably doesn't help with weight loss. It's a very specialistic diet, and it's only used for IBS and other conditions that affect the bowels. It should be under the supervision of a clinical dietitian or a healthcare professional that has been trained in FODMAP diet, or a gastroenterologist. FODMAP per se means fermentable oligo, di, mono, and saccharides and polyols.
Bit of a mouthful.
Fancy words, very big words that mean small carbohydrates. So they're literally just some types of sugars that the body of an IBS person won't be able to digest and absorb, and they will reach the far end of the gut where all the bacteria are, most of the bacteria are, and cause havoc, cause the symptoms that we then experience when we have IBS. And so that diet means reducing the amount of those sugars. So we're trying to do an exclusion diet first. For the first 3 to 8 weeks, we would exclude all of those foods, all the categories, the different groups. And then afterwards, we will reintroduce them very gradually, very carefully, one at a time. Otherwise, we will never know which one would cause symptoms and which one would be fine. And eventually, you go on in your life being aware of what causes you symptoms, and then reintroducing foods as much as possible over time. So it is not a diet for life, and that may be a misconception, because a lot of people think that maybe they have to do that diet for life, which is not the case at all. And it is not a nutritionally complete diet, so we would never recommend that to follow long-term or without supervision. In fact, by cutting out such big food groups, people can become malnourished. One of the food groups is dairy, for example, and if we didn't have substitutes that contain calcium, we might end up with calcium deficiency. Other vegetables that are rich in potassium and magnesium, once we cut them all out, could lead to a deficiency that could be quite dire for our organs and our health. So obviously, we have to be very careful to assess the patient, see if they're suitable, if they are actually meant to do this diet, and then do it very carefully for only a short period of time. I myself have done the diet with a private dietitian, and it is really good, and it's very difficult, but it can produce really good results. In fact, statistically, it works on about 70% of patients, which in medical terms is brilliant. I mean, we never get that much result, apart from possibly the obviously gluten-free diet for celiac patients. But it doesn't work for everyone. And of course, because it's so difficult to follow, it's possible that a lot of patients might not be able to adhere to the diet completely. And not even...
So, yeah, it's not a diet for everyone.
Yeah. Maybe not even because they don't want to, but by accident. You could literally be eating out and accidentally eat something you were meant to have. There are a lot of foods to exclude. There are different categories, so you'd have to exclude a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, all dairy and all wheat-containing foods, and all of those sugars and like fake sugars, the sweeteners that are in a lot of manufactured food. So it isn't an easy diet to follow. It requires a lot of commitment and time and possibly money to buy food in a different way and prepare yourself your own food, so skills. So it's not an easy one. But once it's done, it can really help. It can really help you find your triggers and how to manage them.
And obviously we've mentioned it's not a diet for life. So it's a complex diet, but you can get the right advice if you go and see your GP or a dietitian who's trained in the FODMAP diet, or you know where to turn for the right resources. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it can be quite powerful in just helping you understand what your triggers are. And when we last spoke, Erica, you were saying that initially you were diagnosed with wheat intolerance. And in fact, you have found out it wasn't wheat by following this diet. What was it?
In fact, it was garlic and onion mainly for me, and to a certain extent dairy. So it wasn't even wheat at all. And the problem with that misdiagnosis was the fact that I'd excluded wheat completely. And I did that for a number of years. And I actually ended up being quite deficient in nutrients. And I was always very sluggish and exhausted, tired. And that's because a lot of wheat products have a lot of nutrients. They do contain energy. They contain multivitamins. They contain all of our B vitamins that give us the energy to function. I had excluded them all. I was pretty much making myself malnourished for no reason. I wasn't advised properly at the time, so basically I wasn't substituting it to the right food, because yes, you can be wheat intolerant and have wheat-free products for life and be perfectly healthy. I just didn't get that second part of the advice. And unfortunately, a long time ago, many years ago, in a different country, there wasn't that knowledge and that support, but luckily now we do.
And it's great because having followed the diet, you've reintroduced so many things back into your diet, and you've got a much more balanced, healthy diet now that you've understood that dairy is a bit of a culprit and garlic is the big one. And garlic is such a difficult one to avoid.
Absolutely.
If you're not cooking for yourself, really, because it seems to be in every restaurant meal, ready meal known to mankind out there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Your diet can feel a little bland at times, but you learn. And I'm not a good cook at all. I am a terrible cook, actually. So I do like to go out, and I like when my friends cook for me. It just needs a little bit more planning and a little bit of chatting with the people that are rendering your food, basically. Most people are very supportive and they want to help. No chef wants to make their customer sick. Of course, that wouldn't do for the reviews. So I've talked to many chefs, and I've emailed restaurants in advance, and I've asked if they can adapt the food, and they're always happy to. I don't see why they would refuse. If they would, then you wouldn't want to really be a customer there, would you?
No, it's true. And, I sort of, maybe we started the conversation a bit negatively about saying how complicated and difficult the diet is, but the diet is doable, and there are some realistic things, and it's okay if you have slip-ups, as no doubt a lot of people have had over Christmas, but you can kind of get back on track. And in fact, I found that those slip-ups really help people understand that the diet might be working for them or not working for them, or what it was that might have been causing the issue. But any other sort of tips that you've got around making this diet a bit more manageable and easier, and getting the most out of the experience of following this specific diet for your IBS?
Well, normally we don't start the diet immediately with patients or clients. We would go through a phase 0 first. I call it phase 0 just for convenience, which is the time before starting the FODMAP diet. And that's because there are some reasons that we could have those symptoms that are not necessarily the foods. It might be more of a lifestyle change that we need. For example, maybe we're rushing around and we're skipping meals. So we always give those tips first, and they can help, because once you start practicing those things first, then the diet doesn't feel so daunting, because then you're already used to having regular meals, to avoiding certain foods, and for example, very rich, very fatty foods, or very high caffeinated drinks and fizzy drinks and other alcoholic drinks, and for example, eating really quickly, not chewing properly. All of those things have to come first, and then we start talking about the foods and the foods that we could exclude. By that time, you might be getting used to having a food diary, perhaps using an app where you can record your food, and things become a little bit more doable. And just remembering that even the exclusion phase, which is a total exclusion of all those foods, only lasts about 3 to 8 weeks at the most. And the more accurate you are, the more precise you are, the less time you need to try. And in fact, it took me only 1 week to get amazing results. After a week, I was hooked. I was like, I will do this forever if I had to. Obviously, I didn't have to. But that's the thing. IBS is incredibly uncomfortable, and living with IBS is not easy. It's one of the conditions that people don't talk about, and we don't know what to do, and no one wants to hear about it, and we're just hiding it and suffering in silence. So to find something that works feels like you would do it. You literally will do it because it's worth it. And with the help of a dietitian or a GP, whoever is supporting you, it's not that difficult and not that horrible after all.
Yeah, and if you do it properly, with the right guidance, and you do it properly and safely, as I think you also mentioned about making sure that your diet's still nutritionally balanced. There's lots of foods that you can eat that are low in FODMAPs and are acceptable. It's just kind of focusing a little bit more on what you can eat, not what you can't, is to try to get through that process quickly. And we want to get people through that process quite quickly because we know that there are obviously a few long-term consequences, longer-term consequences, maybe not permanent, that affect your gut bacteria. But I think you have mentioned, and this sort of brings me onto this topic of prebiotics. Someone nicely asked this question about the difference between FODMAPs and prebiotics. And of course, Erica, a lot of FODMAPs are actually prebiotics, which is why they are working and support our gut health. And that's why we don't want people to be on this diet too long, because they're removing prebiotics, good food for your bacteria, from your diet for a long time period, and you want to bring them back and ensure that your gut microbiome bounces back. Any sort of thoughts on that in terms of prebiotics and FODMAPs? Exactly. Are there any prebiotics out there that are non-FODMAP that you know?
Not really. And I mean, there are some probiotics that can help, and there are some that have been studied properly with clinical studies, so they might be beneficial. We don't know enough to be able to recommend all of them, of course, but they can be tried. In terms of prebiotics, because they cause a lot of those issues with the symptoms, then it's best to exclude for that time. But once your gut has healed and rested and has had the time to get back to normal, then you can reintroduce them very gradually. So those foods don't have to be excluded for life, unless there are things that really don't agree with you at all. And then you can still try different ones and find the one that works for you. And it may not even be the food itself that is disrupting your gut flora. It could be things like taking medicine like antibiotics or stress. And we now know very well that there is a very strong link between our brain and cognitive function and all kind of mental health issues and our gut. And so we know that stress, anxiety, and depression might affect our gut even before any food. So then we have to watch those as well, and not just the foods. Prebiotics sound great, but it may not work for that person at that time. You might be able to try it later on. And then it depends on the type of IBS. IBS is not just one type of condition. It's a syndrome, so it can come with different symptoms. And it's a functional disease. So there's nothing that physically shows that there is a problem. So if you have a test like a colonoscopy, you wouldn't see changes in the cells. You wouldn't see damage in the walls of your bowels. It's the way that the bowel functions, and it is very, very individual. That's why it's so difficult to pinpoint and address, because for one person, that amount of, say, lentils doesn't cause any problem. For the next person, it causes bloating, pain, and a lot of horrible symptoms. So we have to assess the individual one by one. So that's what I usually do with my patients that want to try probiotics and prebiotics. We have to go by trying one at a time, so that you have a few days to see the reaction of your body, keeping a food questionnaire, a food diary, so that you know that you've tried that one. That one works, we keep it. The one that doesn't work, we stay clear for now. And then we start adding up more and more.
Yeah, and we've learned that no two people are the same. as you have just mentioned, everybody's got a different gut, everybody's got different life circumstances, perhaps different symptoms that they're trying to manage. So that's why it's fantastic to kind of follow this process step by step of elimination and careful challenges. And then after you finish the process of understanding what might be dietary triggers, I think it's really powerful to go and look at what all those other triggers might be, such as stress or sleep, or perhaps not doing exercise. And all of these things compound to lead or aggravate to people's symptoms. And it was really interesting, as you sort of mentioned, that dairy and garlic has been an issue for you. Someone else on the chat mentioned that onions was their trigger. So not everybody reacts to the same FODMAPs. Quick definition for everybody though on probiotics versus prebiotics. Prebiotics is the food to feed your good bacteria, so good forms of different types of fiber, and probiotic is forms of good bacteria that you're sort of taking either as a tablet or a little shot drink or something like that to sort of top up your bacteria. So thanks, Erica. That was
and also when
good explanation.
If you have a session with a dietitian or a nutritionist trained in FODMAP, they'll be able to give you tips on substitutions. Basically, the person that can't have garlic might be able to use a garlic infused oil, not homemade, because we can't make it completely pure with no traces of garlic. But if you buy it in the supermarket, then it's processed enough to have excluded all pieces and bits of garlic. So the oil tastes the same as the garlic, that you would have in the dish, but you don't have the actual garlic. For onion, you can use the green part of spring onions, for example. So you still get to eat nice food. You just have to know which foods you can use to substitute the ones that you have to exclude at that time or for some time in your life. So
for someone who's been diagnosed with IBS and their GP's told them to go away and do the low FODMAP diet, where can they get more information? Well, and obviously not all information on the internet is reliable. So, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about where they can get that reliable information from.
I mean, most GPs would normally refer the patient to a dietitian that has a clinic in the NHS. Unfortunately, with COVID, the waiting times are incredibly long and a lot of clinics cannot be carried out anymore because of everything that has happened. So it may be the case that someone has to find a private dietitian and some information online. When it comes to online information, I always tell my clients to be cautious because of course there is so much information out there, and if we don't know who is giving us this information, it could be wrong, it could be misleading, it could actually do more harm than good. So if you look for a website, just have a look, see who is creating this website and writing about it and checking the information. Is there a dietitian, a registered dietitian behind the website or the blog that you're reading? Is there a gastroenterologist or a doctor? You can check their credentials as well. If dietitians have a register, you can just put the name on it and find out that if they're registered. For example, when it comes to the actual FODMAP training, King's College has a list of all FODMAP trained dietitians. It's available from their website, and they have all of the phone numbers and email addresses to contact them, and they're reviewed periodically anyway. When it comes to apps, obviously there's the Monash app, which started everything. And if you want to use a different app, there are others on the App Store. For example, the Tummy one that I work for, and they're all good to use as a tool. And of course, if then they have a link to a dietitian, you would get that backup so that if something doesn't work for the app or you're not very clear what's happening with the app and you want a bit more information, you're going to be able to ask a dietitian. And I don't mean to insult anyone else, but obviously a dietitian that is fully trained by the health provider that has created the diet and has researched it and checked it constantly will be more reliable than someone else that might speak only by personal experience or other reading and studying that may not be as rigorous.
Yeah, correct. And I think it applies to any information that you get around health and disease. Check where the information is coming from. Check who's written it, what are their credentials, and if if in doubt, start with the NHS. Look at
Yes.
the NHS website first and foremost, and then speak to your GP or find a registered healthcare professional to
Mm-hmm.
help you out on the journey so that you get the right information and you're put on the right journey. You mentioned allergy. Interesting. There's a question that's come up now is, can IBS run in families? Could it be genetics that are involved as well in that? I don't know if you have any thoughts whether it's genetically related. I know from my experience within allergies that there's a very strong genetic connection for allergies, and you're more likely to have allergies if you have two parents that have both got allergies versus one. I mean, you're likely to have them if you've got one parent, but even more likely with two parents. Is that possibly the same thing with IBS?
It may be, but the thing is, we don't have enough to go about to be able to say that that's the case. And the thing is that it's a functional disease. It's not a disease that you can put under a microscope in terms of like a colonoscopy, biopsy, and you don't have a lot of empirical data. You can't have things like your allergy reaction is mediated by your body, and you can see that. But with a functional disease, what my symptoms are may be completely different than another. So to find a common denominator is not that easy. And unfortunately, we still need a lot of research anyway. Even the diagnosis is a bit complex because it's a syndrome, so it needs to be addressed in a different way. So we have criteria that we use to diagnose it, but it's not as straightforward as a single disease. And so it may not be as easy to isolate as an allergy might be, actually. And genetic conditions like celiac disease. And there's also a lot of new things that we know now that, for example, our mental health and our brain function affects our gut, because now we know that there are so many neurotransmitters and neurological, like system in our gut that we didn't even know before. So we don't know yet.
Correct. And so we've discussed what the diet is, what the process is, and how to go about and get some more information if you are going to follow the diet. For those that are following the diet, maybe had a bit of tricky eating, festive eating, fallen off the wagon, so to say. Do you have any sort of top tips for them to help them as they head into the new year?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Christmas meal can be adjusted, but if you don't know, then it can be actually a minefield, basically, because obviously with the vegetables and the sauces and the alcohol, that can definitely trigger our IBS, and then we pay the consequences the week after Christmas. That could be a really not a very nice lesson, but maybe a way to look forward to the new year and try this new way of eating that might help you get better. And that may mean just to start with things that are doable. You don't even have to go for the FODMAP diet just yet. Just think about, for example, having more regular meals. Instead of having one meal like at Christmas, we have one big meal in the afternoon. Then try and have always regular meals, 3 meals a day, having small amounts of food. The less food you give the gut to deal with, the better, because obviously it doesn't get overworked where things can go a bit wrong. And having less alcohol, less rich foods that are so usually very typical with Christmas menus, and avoiding some foods like, for example, dried fruit that you would find in the pudding or in the cake, and obviously a lot of fruits, juices that you might find on the menu, sauces, very rich food. So just by doing that, you might just reset a little bit your symptoms, so you might feel a little bit better. And once you're settled and you're feeling a little bit less stressed over the symptoms, perhaps just start doing things that we always think about as New Year resolutions, something to do with, stress management, maybe something to do with, a calming new book to read, or things like activities that you might enjoy, or a yoga course, or anything at all that can help with that kind of trigger, anxiety, stress, and possibly also depression that can happen around Christmas time. And once you feel that you're addressing all of those things, then if you want to to follow the FODMAP diet, perhaps consider asking your GP if you can be referred to a dietitian. If they don't have that at the moment with the NHS, then you can definitely look into getting a private dietitian. You don't need to see a dietitian for years. It's only maybe 2 or 3 sessions just to get the information you need and the support for those few weeks. And you try it. If it works for you, then you can definitely continue monitoring yourself later on by yourself. And that could be just a possibility that you consider for the new year for yourself, as a present to yourself. But I would definitely start with resetting the foods and the meal times and all of our other issues like anxiety, stress that we get a lot, especially around Christmas.
Yeah, there's so much pressure to make this the perfect family day and get all the right presents and make the right meal and enjoy
Exactly.
it.
And you don't have to have IBS to end up with an indigestion anyway.
It's true. It's so true. And of course, you also have mentioned to me that you are vegetarian, and I know that there are a lot of people who are going to be heading into January and perhaps starting a more plant-based diet or a vegan diet. Do you have any tips for those who are following the low FODMAP diet on how to do that in a healthy, balanced way?
Yes. When I thought about doing the FODMAP diet as a vegetarian, I thought, why am I doing this to myself? It's like the worst thing I could ever think of. But it's not impossible. It seems difficult because obviously as a vegetarian or a vegan, excluding those foods that are main sources of your protein, your nutrients, might be a bit daunting. So what we suggest is that if you only eat those foods like say lentils, chickpeas, etc. as your main source of protein, then we may not do a full FODMAP diet. Not everyone can do the diet anyway, so it depends on your individual case. If you might use other products that you could buy that are acceptable for the FODMAP diet, for example, you could get meals that are already certified low FODMAP diet, like Diet Doctor, and other ingredients that you can search there, dairy-free, gluten-free, etc. Then that might be the solution, at least for that period of time. Otherwise, if they only want to stick with the natural plant food, then we can suggest quantities changed. So just for a period of time, we can reduce the amount. For example, at small doses, small amounts, even chickpeas, lentils, beans, and so on that are very high FODMAP can be eaten safely, and especially if they are canned, because the FODMAP, those carbohydrates leak in the fluid, in the water, or in the can. So as long as you throw away the water and don't eat the whole can, just follow the advice on the portions. You can get the portions from the Monash app or the Tummy app, or a lot of resources like books on FODMAP. You can get the exact amount you need, then you can still eat them. It's not impossible. I mean, it seems daunting, of course, especially being healthy when you have to exclude most vegetables and fruit seems a bit absurd, but it's not impossible. There are a lot of vegetables and fruit you can still eat. There are substitutes, especially nowadays. You go to the supermarket, you can find a lot of wheat-free food, a dairy-free range, and you can find gluten-free foods that maybe were meant for gluten-free diets like celiac disease patients' diets, but we can use them for that time being, and we have to follow the FODMAP diet. So there are solutions. There are really things that we can do around an individual diet. Your diet always has, like more precedent than the FODMAP diet. So if you're following a specialist diet with a consultant for another condition, we would take that first and in consideration, of course. If you can't do the diet for other reasons, for example, if you have an eating disorder or some food aversions, we wouldn't suggest the FODMAP diet at all. We would look at other things like lifestyle changes and the meal patterns and all other things that we can do with changing perhaps the foods, but without being so restrictive and so strict. So that's why it's a very individual program, and that's why it's best to have a dietitian that helps you, and it's between you and the dietitian how to work out a menu planner and your meals and even the ingredients that you put in your meal. You could even come up with recipes for yourself for that time, depending on what you want as support, of course.
And if you're struggling, just ask for help. There's plenty of help out there.
Absolutely. There are a lot of websites with recipes. I always tell my patients, be cautious with people that tell you things that are medical and scientific knowledge, but a recipe that has been checked by a dietitian and you can follow, that could be already a good way to start things for yourself anyway.
And Erica, you mentioned if someone has another condition alongside IBS, you would say to focus on that condition first. We had one question that came through that said, is the diet suitable for an IBS sufferer who's just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes? What is your view on that?
Yes, it can be definitely okay. For example, that a type 2 diabetic patient should avoid fruit juice anyway, because it would be very high in fructose and therefore increase their blood glucose. And we have to exclude fruit juice anyway for the FODMAP diet. So we can find a lot of similarities and a lot of points in common where actually doesn't disrupt our diabetic, needs. There isn't a specific diabetic diet anyway, so we can just explain how they need to eat. And for example, for type 2 diabetic patients, you would recommend anyway to have regular meals, smaller portions of carbohydrates. So they actually are okay together. I mean, yes, you could definitely do both, follow your blood glucose control diet and the FODMAP diet. You just have to be cautious when you reintroduce the food, so not to go overboard with some foods. And think about it, it's a lot of things that might be difficult are those sweeteners that we find in a lot of diabetic products and in a lot of diet, like weight loss diet products. So we have to then consider the situation. It's not impossible to exclude them from our diet and still lose weight. I'm doing it as an example. But of course, it's a matter of assessing your need. So if you don't have a reaction, a terrible reaction with those sugar alcohols, you know, all of those oils, the sorbitol, mannitol, and all the others that they use for those low-calorie foods, then you might be okay with them. If they cause you issues, you might need to have very little amounts. And usually they're not for foods that are an essential. So they're usually for extras, like a sweet treat or a pudding or something. So anyway, you wouldn't necessarily want to have that kind of food every day. And even your diabetic nurse and doctor would tell you, if you did have those, try to have them in moderation anyway, because even if you don't have IBS, at that kind of large amount can still cause you issues with your bowels anyway. So, and diabetic products are not needed at all. In fact, I'm sorry about the manufacturers. I don't mean to put them down, but they're not actually necessary. They might be okay for an occasional treat, but we don't need them to survive. So at the end of the day, it is a personal choice. And with IBS, a lot of things depend on what you choose to do, and considering how your symptoms are, they might be worth making that change, making that adjustment. So for me, if I have to give up garlic, I'm Italian, to not have problems, I will live with it. It's not ideal, but it's not impossible. But then it's a personal choice, so you know, we can only advise and give some support.
Yep, that's correct. And one final question. Any top tips from your years of experience of working within FODMAP that you would like to share with everyone?
Well, for me, the most important thing it's nothing to do with the food at all and the diet, but it's about talking about the condition. IBS is still a bit stigmatized because obviously no one wants to talk about bowel problems and bowel movements, especially not when you're having your lunch break at work, where people will look at you thinking, is it sanitary to be next to this person when I'm having my food if they've just been to the toilet with those symptoms? So it can be very difficult. It can be very isolating. You can feel embarrassed and humiliated, and you could get in emergency situations where obviously you have to deal with things that are very sad, and obviously they will make our IBS even worse, because anxiety, stress, and depression will make things even worse. So I always tell everyone to talk about it. There is no shame, there is no embarrassment. It's a health condition, it's a health problem, and there is so much more work that is being done and offered to patients nowadays, and there are companies and doctors, the NHS, we're all working to help, but we can only help if you come to us. So if you come to us, for example, Phil Doctor, Tommy, Monash, or your GP, then we can have help. I had the IBS for years before I even spoke to my GP, and I haven't told my family and friends until about 10 years ago. 20 years I kept it to myself and my doctor only, because I was embarrassed, and I was obviously also worried and scared that at work I might be penalized, I might not be allowed to do certain things because of all of the belief that you might be contagious, or it could be something that might affect you touching things, and so on and so on. So if you go to the Tummy website, you can see some articles that have been written about this topic, and also some testimonials from people that have used the app and have talked about their experience. And I think it helps people feel free to finally talk about it and ask for help.
I think you're right. So you've heard it here, everyone. If you suspect you have IBS, go get a diagnosis, go see your GP and explore those symptoms and get a proper diagnosis. And if you have been diagnosed, there's absolutely no shame talking about it. Talk about it with your friends and family, and get the support that you need from everyone around you. You don't have to suffer in silence. And there are lots of healthcare professionals and lots of services now available to help you. So thanks,
You'd be surprised
Erica.
how many people have it. I mean, maybe we're all being quiet about it, and there are no symptoms that are too little. Even if you're always bloated, and bloating isn't the end of the world, well, if it affects your life and your quality of life, ask for help.
Agreed. And it's time and time again, I hear of people who, if they don't have IBS, they know someone who has IBS. So it's incredibly common. Thank you, Erica. I've really enjoyed our chat. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to everyone for joining us on this weird Twixmas day. I don't know, is it a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? But I know that the new year is coming, and wishing you all a happy new year and a happy, healthy 2022. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.